one.
Okay, we can start. So, good evening all, and on behalf of the Maltese Young Christian Workers and in collaboration with Newsbook, I have the pleasure to welcome you to the first lecture of this Cardane lecture series. My name is Justin Kirkhope and I'm a member of the Maltese Young Christian Workers. Claims made by extreme free marketeers about Catholic social teaching require us to take another look at the uneasy relationship between Catholicism and capitalism. Capital markets have become the new temples of the capitalist system, very often substituting politics in the same way that individualism has substituted personhood. In his encyclical Centesimus Annus, John Paul II offered a forceful reflection on unbridled capitalist systems. Throughout its history, the Maltese Young Christian Workers has always endeavored to put the human person and its inherent dignity at the center of its economic and political proposals. In these times of unbridled capitalism, it is high time that we should bring this issue to the fore of our agenda. For this reason, I am delighted to introduce Professor Stefano Zamagni, who will be delivering tonight's lecture entitled A Christian Critique of the Capitalist System. Professor Zamagni is a professor of economics at the University of Bologna and adjunct professor of international political economy at Johns Hopkins University Bologna Center. His research interests include civil economy, welfare economics, theory of consumer behavior, social choice theory, economic epistemology, ethics, and history of economic thought. In 2013, Pope Francis appointed Professor Zamagni a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, while in March 2019, the Pope appointed him president of the same academy. He is also a member of both the Pontifical Council on Justice and Peace and of the Scientific Committee of the Pontifical Council for Culture. And now some housekeeping notices. During the lecture, your microphones will be muted. However, you are encouraged to send any questions you have on the lecture using the Zoom chat function. After the lecture, we will have 10 to 15 minutes when Professor Zamagni will answer questions which you would have sent us during the lecture. We want also to inform you that this lecture is being recorded, and should you have problems following this Zoom session, this lecture is also being streamed on both the ZHN and Newsbook Facebook pages. And now, dear Professor Zamagni, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me express my gratitude to Father Joe Nguanez for the invitation, which I accepted very, very happily. Now, let me first of all say that I visited your beautiful island several times, and I've always been impressed by the level of dedication that you devoted to culture. And the topic of tonight, it's a peculiar one, even though I will follow not so much a theological approach, but an economic approach, which is the subject that I cultivate, as of course you know, and as the presenter said. And let me start from a quotation by David Brooks, the columnist of the New York Times, who recently wrote, I quote, "A society is healthy when its culture counterbalances its economics. When you have a capitalist economic system that emphasizes competition, dynamism, individual self-interest, you need a culture that celebrates cooperation, stability, and committed relationship. On the other hand, our culture today takes the disruptive and dehumanizing aspects of capitalism and makes them worse," unquote. If you pay attention, this is a remarkable quotation coming from a journalist, because he got exactly the point. The point is not so much with what happens with capitalism per se, but what is happening with our culture. Because what we lack today is a counterbalance. So it is important to stress this point, because many people believe that if we could change the system, but unless we change the culture, there is nothing to be done. Before going ahead, entering into my topic, let me clarify a point of central relevance, which is almost often forgotten. Of course, the major responsibility is of the economists, who never clarify what they use in their argumentation or in their papers, etc. The point is that the new technological paradigm could, in principle, make everybody better off, provided that there is a sufficient political will. So that is the point. Today, we lack political will. Now, what lies at the bottom of this fact? As you know, the economic effects of the new technologies, the so-called technologies associated to the fourth industrial revolution, can be decomposed into two parts. The first one is that the new technology raise overall output, which is, in fact, wealth and global income in the last few decades continue to increase. And this extra output is earned by someone in the economy. But then there is also the second effect, that the new technologies also generate a redistribution of the economic pie, as it changes the market prices at which people transact in the economy. In other words, the process associated to the new technology is not only a factor determining an increase of the size of the pie, which everybody understands, but also modifies the redistribution. And the redistribution via price changes is always a zero-sum game, which means what you obtain, I lose. Now, this is what is called in economic theory pecuniary externalities. Now, if you want to bet with me, ask an economist, even professors, if they know about pecuniary externalities. Most of them would answer, I never heard, or I don't know. That is the tragedy. Because if we talk about the technological externalities, everybody knows. What is the typical example of a technological externality? Pollution. If I have a factor, I pollute, I generate a negative technological externalities, because that effect can be observed and can be measured. On the other hand, pecuniary externalities are those consequences of an economic action that operate via the price mechanism. In other words, changing what is called the structure of relative prices. Consider typical example of food, which occurred in the year 2009, immediately after the financial crisis. What happened was that the stock exchange of Chicago allowed the derivatives issued based on the price of fundamental commodities such as grain, rice, etc. Speculation in the time span of few months more than doubled the price of these fundamental items, such as I said, rice, grain, and similar items. So the poor people whose income has remained more or less the same, of course, they had to starve, because if you double the price, it is obvious that you have to half the quantity bought and consumed. Now, when that occurred, people said, but we did not want to influence the life conditions of people living in India or in Southeastern Asia or in Africa. We did our job, speculation. And as you know, Obama, he was the president, immediately issued a decree whereby it was forbidden since then to speculate on the prices of commodities. But that occurred after a major disaster occurred. That is only one example. So pecuniary externalities are invisible. It's not like technological externalities. that can be seen. If there is a smoke out of the chimney of my factory, everybody can detect it, etc. So it is obvious, to conclude on this point, if we only care about efficiency and not equity, it is obvious that pecuniary externalities have to be ignored. That is why economists typically never talk, because for the typical economist, or better to say mainstream economist, the only economic problem is efficiency. What does it mean, efficiency? Increasing the size of the pie, increasing what is called GDP or any other measures. But if you take equity also as well as efficiency into consideration, it is obvious that you cannot forget about pecuniary externalities. Now, this is a point of clarification which is needed, because most people behave as if they were not in existence. The same is true with what happens with, for instance, during the pandemic with the GAFAM. GAFAM is the acronym which stands for Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. There are 5 giants, all of them from California. Now, during the pandemic, they increased their profits simply because, as a consequence of the pandemic, people had to interact among themselves via a distance or via webinars or one time. So they increased the selling of their product in a manner that was unbelievable. But that is not a merit of those companies, simply because they took advantage of in this case, a critical fact like a pandemic without contributing to cope with it. Now, I move, having said so, if the goal is to move ahead towards a different kind of economy, one that is inclusive and not exclusive, humane and not dehumanizing, an economy that cares for the environment, not despoiling it. If that is the goal, what should be done? In other words, what Catholic social teaching, or better to say Christian social teaching, because it's not only Catholic Church, but many other churches, such as the Anglican Church, or even in a different way, Orthodox Church, etc. In other words, what should be proposed if the target is not only to increase efficiency, but also to increase the rate of fairness in the economy? And by fairness mean to allow everybody to develop his or her potential. Now, let me indicate a few, 5, not because they are the only policies, but they, in my opinion, are the 5, let's say, decisions which are mostly urgent to be implemented. The first one has to do with the still prevalent mood in economics based on the wrong concept of value. Because if you talk to common people and say, what is value for you? The answer is, value is identified with market price. Now, that is the most terrible mistakes that, again, the major fault goes to the economists, because they keep on writing textbooks which are wrong, I know all the textbooks because I am a teacher myself, because one thing is the notion of value, another thing is the notion of market price. And so such a reductionist notion of value has many consequences for the way the economic system is structured. For instance, relational goods, care goods, commons, you know what are the commons, are not public goods, gratuitousness goods, etc., do not enter the metric of GDP. GDP includes only the market price or the goods which have a market price. But you know what is a relational good or a care good. But what is the price of a smile, offered to somebody who is in bed in an hospital. Can you attach a price to that? On the other hand, can you deny that that act has a value? So that is the first point. Christian social teaching urges us to modify the metric according to which GDP is measured. There is a famous quotation by John Maynard Keynes, a great British economist, as you know. Now, in his essays in Persuasion, he wrote, I quote, it is a fantastic quote, "We shall once more value ends above means and prefer the good to the useful." Can you imagine a British economist? Don't forget that utilitarianism was born in Britain. You know that. Utilitarian philosophy is an exclusive British invention, which spread elsewhere in the world later. And Keynes said that we should prefer the good to the useful. Useful has to do with the utility. So that is, we should abandon our instrumentalist orientation, where means get all our attention and the ends virtually none, and focus on what makes people truly happy. That is the first, let's say, measure of policies, or even better to say, the first strategy to be pursued. Second, companies need to embrace a sense of purpose beyond making only profits. On this, nowadays, the literature is rather, I would say, abundant, but it's proper to remind it. In other words, companies, they have to consider the well-being of all the stakeholders, not only of the shareholders. You know, there is a long story which was started with the famous Milton Friedman declaration in an interview to the New York Times in the year 1970, when he said, there is only one social responsibility of companies, to maximize profit. Of course, Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winner in economics, he knew, because he emphasized which condition should be followed in order to give to such a sentence a meaning. But what happened is that the followers who were brought, and again, that is another scandal of most economists, because they followed the expression by Friedman, without paying attention to the conditions. I don't know if in the audience there are economists, but you know what is a variation economic system. He was referring to a general economic equilibrium variation type. In that case, it is true what he said. But since the world does not fit that model, it is obvious that his statement has no meaning at all. And still, even nowadays, there are people repeating that story. That is terrible, because that means that ignorance is terrible. When people are ignorant, they keep on making fuss and spreading fake truth, not fake news. Right? Now, today, enlightened business leaders are understanding that focusing on maximizing shareholder value has no future. The tendency is to move toward what is called a total societal impact. Keep that in mind. That this is an expression that in the near future will become rather common. Today is not yet common. Total societal impact, according to which companies as cognitive institutions are considering the impact of their activities on the social and environmental dimension, as well as on the proper economic one. In this regard, there is a real paradox characterizing the business world. And that is a very serious. I don't know if you are familiar with big business and with the CEO, chief executive officers of major companies. But if you are familiar, you know that they are suffering a lot because they are suffering of a major contradiction. And what is the contradiction? The following: that the golden rule of managerial culture is the prohibition to mix language and the emotions of private life with those that belong to the business life. In other words, the idea is when you enter the business, you have to forget about your identity. Never mind if you are a father or a mother, if you have children or not, if your children are okay or not, etc. Once you enter your office or your laboratory, whatever, you have to identify yourself with the firm, the company for which you are working. And so words such as gift, gratitude, friendship, mercy, or fraternity, they are banned in the workplace since they are considered improper. But here is the contradiction. On the other hand, when the same business managers, top executives, they have to hire new people, they pretend that the new people will exhibit a sense of fairness, a sense of loyalty, blah, 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 not cheating, etc. But that even a child would admit that it's a contradiction, because you cannot pretend that the people you are hiring should be morally okay, and then when they start working, you ask them to forget about their moral or religious identity. The two things cannot stay together. So that is why the new capitalism of this epoch has discovered this contradiction. And that explains why in many countries, Italy included, I don't know so much about Malta, but there are, the situation are changing. I don't know if you know the famous declaration of 2 years ago by the Economic Roundtable of the United States, when more than 130 CEOs signed up the famous declaration. Okay, a third point is the following. It is urgent to rewiring finance, which requires that the financial accounting system include social and environmental metrics, and that the impact investing becomes a norm of behavior. Now, a point should be made clear in this context. The pursuit of profit is not the problem per se, as many people believe. Don't get confused. The real problem is in the incompleteness of the profit calculation, namely what is left out. Because the fact that a firm should make profit is obvious. Otherwise, we would not talk about economic reality. What is not obvious is the way you calculate profit. And the omissions are today unbearable. For instance, it is considered, what I said before, technological externalities. If I pollute, why I do not include in my balance sheet the cost that I have created polluting, because I did not want to put filters in my machineries, etc., etc. So the real problem today is not to make a war against profit, as certain people, perhaps in bona fide, say, but they are ideological. The real problem is to say profit is okay, provided that when you draw the balance sheet and the difference between cost and revenues, etc., in order to determine profit, because profit is revenues minus cost. So what we should ask, that in the cost calculations, also the hidden and indirect costs are determined. That is the point. We record the value of what we harvest from nature, but make no matching entry for its degradation. If we could do that, you can be sure that the tremendous extra profits of many giants companies would disappear. Fourth, a fourth line of action has to do with the role of governments. Now, governments need to reaffirm their fundamental role in fixing the rules of the economic game in view of the common good, and not for the interest of particular groups of actors. Because without rules, globalization becomes a jungle. What is today? The global market poses problems, not because of globalization again, but of the way globalization is managed. In other words, it is not acceptable an economy in which the market and political powers allow privileged individuals and businesses to extract a great deal of rent from everybody else. This is the so-called extractivist attitude, which has no meaning from an economic point of view, because a true economist knows that rents are always dangerous to the development process, because rents is not the same thing as profits and wages. But what is more, we democracies have to make a decision. And the decision is between two alternative concepts of global economic governance. A concept that Danny Roderick, an American economist, rather famous, has called one, globalization enhancing global governance. The other one, democracy enhancing global governance. We have to make a decision. And so far, at the international level, nothing has been said. Why? Because China prefers the first one. For China, globalization is, global governance is to be targeted at enhancing globalization per se. On the other hand, democratic countries, they want a global government, a global governance, which is aimed at democracy enhancing, which means, in poor words, when we talk about free trade, blah, 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 etc., what is the ultimate target? The ultimate target is to increase even more the globalization process, or we want to democratize? Because trade can be used in other ways. We can use trade in order to increase the democratic rule, or we can use trade in order to favor the interest of autocratic governments. And that is a decision which has to be taken at the international level, in particular the WTO, World Trade Organization. And some people say, oh, that is not, why it is not possible? Who can say so? Because it is obvious that originally the World Trade Organization, when it was created after the Second World War, it was decided by a group of politicians representing, in that case, the winning powers, etc. I know that today is more difficult, but more difficult does not mean that it is impossible. In this sense, what the critical concept is the one expressed by John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, when in his encyclical letter Sollecitudo Rei Socialis, which was published in the year 1987, he talked about structures of sin. Now, the notion of structure of sin is the most important concept of the Christian social teaching. What does it mean, structures of sins? It means rules of the game. The Pope said, if the rules of the game are wrong, are unfair, are against the dignity of human being, etc., etc., there is nothing to be done. Even though you personally try to behave correctly, you personally try to apply your vision of the world, if you are working inside a structure which includes the wrong rules of the game, there is nothing to be done. So that is why that notion, which actually was hinted at for the first time by Pope Paul VI, but it was John Paul II who coined that expression. And it is obvious that if these are rules, it is obvious they can be changed. Otherwise, finally, a fifth avenue to modify the present situation is to remember the notion of integral human development, as it is clearly stated in the encyclical Laudato Si by Pope Francis. Integral human development is meant to be transformational, in that it aims to improve people's lives by enhancing their capabilities. So the integral human development approach differs from the conventional approaches to growth. Here, a point of clarification. Why most people confuse growth with development? That is a serious business. Because growth is different from development. Why? Because growth does not apply only to human beings. Even animals grow. Even plants grow. If you have a tree, year after year, it becomes taller and taller. What is typical of human beings is the notion of development, a word which comes from Latin. And in Latin, development, you know what does it mean? Getting free of shackles, getting free of all those conditions which do not allow people to flourish. Never forget. So the notion of integral human development, and so you can appreciate the meaning of the adjective integral, comprises three dimensions. One dimension is growth, and growth refers to the material side, which is okay, because we are human beings, and so we need to eat. We have a body, to be very, very simple. But there are the other two dimensions, which are the social relational dimension and the spiritual dimension. So a project with a project aimed at development, if it is able to maintain the three dimensions, namely the quantitative one, growth, the social relational, and the spiritual in equilibrium. That is the point. On the other hand, what happens, even in Malta, as well as in my country, that we tend to give more and more and too much importance to growth, and forgetting about, for instance, the social relational. What are the consequences? For instance, the destruction of the family. Why the family is in crisis? Tell me why. In the past, it was not like that. Because it is obvious, if the only value is to maximize income, to maximize wealth, to maximize the material dimension, it is obvious that you can't solve the so-called happiness paradox. But people want to be happy, first of all. And to be happy, they need, of course, food to eat. But food is not eaten per se. It's a mean to an end. The same is true with the spiritual dimension. Oh, spiritual does not mean religious. Spiritual means that a model of development is such, is integral human development, if it pays attention to the fact that in a person there is not only the body, but there is also the mind, or the conscience, if you want. So if you organize the society in such a way as this problem of equilibration, of keeping into balance the three dimensions, you have the results that every day we observe. And the consequence is what today everybody knows, namely the increase of the elements of desperation. Now, if you want important reading, go and read the book recently published in America, but the book has been translated in many languages, for instance in Italian, by Angus Deaton and his wife Anne Case. Angus Deaton obtained the Nobel Prize in economics, and he's American. You know what is the title of the book? If you want to buy and read, be careful, because you might not sleep in the night. The title of the book is Death of Despair. Unbelievable, the death of despair. He refers to his country. America is the richest country in the world, but it's the most desperate country in the world. Perhaps you never knew that. Go and check about the rate of suicides. Go and check. Go and read in the chat. Well, I repeat, Angus Deaton, D-E-A-T-O-N. And the title of the book is Death of Despair. Okay? And if you enter, it sells tremendously. Just to give you another example, you know what are homicides? Okay, Angus Deaton, yes. John Caruana has written properly the name. But you have had John Caruana, also the name of his wife, Anne Case, C-A-S-E. And she too is an economist. She did not obtain the Nobel Prize, but she's also a very good economist, etc. As I was saying, the so-called happiness paradox, which was invented, or better to say, discovered in the United States in 1974 by Richard Easterly. Richard Easterly, an economist still alive, and he talked about happiness paradox. To mean what? That beyond a certain threshold of income per capita, further increments of income per capita, instead of increasing the happiness index, decreases it. The curve is like a parabol. The parabol goes up and then goes down, and then made a major problem. Why? Because what is the purpose of life? To be happy. Of course, riches are important, but if to accumulate riches, you forget the horizontal relationship with other people and your spiritual dimension, you become richer, but more and more unhappy. And in the book, you read something unbelievable. The use of drugs, alcohol, suicides, and many other dirty things, and homicides. You know, consider all the homicides in the world. You know, what is the percentage of the global homicides in the world occur in the United States? 43%. 43% of all homicides occur in the United States, which is the richest country. And these are figures that you can obtain reading the book I just quoted. So now, moving towards the conclusion, so we have time, and I will be pleased to answer your question, whatever they are. What can I say? I say that today there is a strong attention towards a Christian social teaching, because people are realizing finally that what is written in various documents is not just sermons or moralistic. No, because what is written goes to the center of the situation. In other words, addressing the major problems of our society today. And I know that until a few decades ago, there were people who were saying, well, there is no way to cure capitalism. No, it's not true. And those same people proposed a revolution. And no, we know today what happened after the revolution. So the only approach which is wise is a transformational approach. We have to transform bit by bit over time the major ingredients of the capitalistic system in order to make it humane and not dishumane. That is the approach that Christianity in general favors, not of throwing away like the revolutionary people of a Marxian type or Mao Zedong type were suggesting, by, on the other hand, the transformational approach. And that is possible. And to conclude, a society in which the principle of fraternity fades from view is a society with no future. That is, a society is not capable of progressing if it is only capable of giving to receive, or of giving as a duty. This is why neither the neoliberal individualistic vision of the world, in which everything constitutes a trade-off, nor the state-centric vision of society, where everything is based on a sense of duty, can safely lead us out of the shadows where we are. That is why we have to move from a model of social order based on the two pillars of state and market only, to a model of social order which is tripolar: state, market, community. And that is, be certain, that is the root of the near future. And when we say community, people might prefer to use a civil society. Never mind, it's not a question of wording. The basic idea is that we need three principles, not only two, because the principle within the market is the principle of exchange of equivalence of value. The principle guiding the so-called public or state sphere is the principle of coercion. The government issues laws or decrees which are obligatory. But we need the third principle if we want to overcome the strictures of our society. That is the principle of reciprocity. So we need the exchange of equivalence, no doubt. We need the principle of coercion. For instance, when the government imposes taxes, that is a coercion. But we also need the principle of reciprocity. And the principle of reciprocity is nothing but the so to speak, the translation into real life of the principle of fraternity, the principle of fraternity. Because reciprocity is, be careful, giving without losing, and obtaining without taking away. That is the reason why the Fratelli Tutti, which is the last encyclica by Pope Francis, is making such a big fuss. Because in that encyclica, Pope Francis, without denying the importance of the other two principles, speaks in favor of the principle of reciprocity, which is the adaptation of the principle of fraternity. So thank you very much for your, perhaps I've spoken even too much. I've spoken 43 minutes. I beg your pardon, and now I am open to question, remarks, observation, whatever you feel like that. Thank you.
Professor Zamagni, thanks a lot for this interesting lecture. We received already a couple of questions from the audience, but I also invite the audience, if they have their questions, to send them through the chat box, and I will relay them to you. Maybe the first question is with respect to corporate social responsibility, and there has been increasing importance for companies to engage in corporate social responsibility, but to a certain extent, the corporate social responsibility is also being used as a marketing tool by companies. So to an extent, corporate social responsibility is also being used as one of the tools of capitalism. What do you think about the use of corporate social responsibility and the reporting of corporate social responsibility by companies.
Thank you. Now, the notion of corporate social responsibility was the wording was coined in the year 1953, 54, when an American economist whose name was Herbert Bowen published on the Harvard Business Review an article whose title was Corporate Social Responsibility. Since then, this expression entered almost everywhere. In Italy, it arrived a bit later, after a few decades, but nowadays is taken for granted. Now, my point is that the notion of corporate social responsibility is not enough today. That is the point. It would take another few years to make people understand the point, because people are stubborn. Stubborn means that they, when learn something, they do not want to change their mentality. Because the new notion is that of corporate civil responsibility, not social responsibility. Now, the question is, what is the difference? The following. The notion of corporate social responsibility asks the firm or the company, whatever, not to do nasty things, such as exploiting workers, such as polluting, such as evading taxes in the tax havens, for instance, etc. So the notion of social responsibility is to ask business managers or CEO not to do certain things. Now, today, that is not enough. The notion of corporate civil responsibility asks firms to do certain things, not to do. You understand that? For instance, ask to do, which means to take care of the context or the society where they operate. So if I am a manager of an important company, and I have my factory, my laboratory, whatever, in a particular country or in a particular region, and I observe that in that region, the schooling system is not proper, or the health system is not working properly, I cannot say to myself, I do not care less. No, because you are operating in that area, you obtain from that community certain advantage, and then you have to cooperate with the other people, with the public authorities and other colleagues like you to solve the problems. That is the point. The point of which that is the point of which became so famous in this pandemic issue. I don't know, but in my country, Italy, a certain number of firms, they took care of that. They didn't say, it is not my business to vaccinate people. Today, not today, in the last few weeks, vaccination is operated inside the firms, inside, because the hospitals were not enough. It would take a long queues. And the firms, they transformed the premises of one type or the other. And of course, nurses, doctors went there to do that. That is an example. Or another example, they are restructuring the schooling system because the state, the government, has not enough resources to restructure, etc. So the real change today is to move from the corporate social to corporate civil responsibility. Because the notion of responsibility, and in this sense, what is the reference point? The Good Samaritans. Why in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis at the beginning uses the parable of the Good Samaritan? Tell me, was the Samaritan responsible of what occurred to the poor fellow? Of course not. He was not the cause. And so the other two, the priest and the other fellow, they did not feel responsible because they did not commit the fact and they passed away. But the Good Samaritan, even though he was not responsible directly, he stopped and helped the poor. That is the point that we have, because he was not compelled, the Good Samaritan, to do that. Here today is the idea going to the front. And there is a growing number of corporations which are understanding this logic, the logic of the Good Samaritan. It is not, I say it for the last time, it is not enough not to do bad things. What is required is to do the good things.
Thanks, Professor Zamagni. We have a question from Kevin Vella, who asks, what role does the welfare state still play, particularly in the context of globalization?
Yes, that is an important question. Again, as you know, welfare state means state. State means government. The welfare state was born in 1942 in Britain. Lord Beveridge was the one who obtained the consensus at the Parliament, Westminster, to pass that. And the idea of the welfare state is the following. The state should take care of their citizens from the cradle to the graves. The famous expression, which is sometimes used even as. In other words, the state should take care of the welfare of the citizens. Now, for the first 2-3 decades, everything went okay. But already in the 80s of last century, immediately two major weaknesses of the welfare state occurred. The first one is financial. The welfare state is not financially sustainable. And those who know some economics know why. Because the curve of the cost of the welfare services is represented by an exponential curve. The curve representing the revenue out of taxation is a similar line with a certain slope. And so over time, the vertical distance between an exponential curve and the linear curve is doomed to increase. And that is the reason why, for instance, consider Italy. Until 1980, the Italian government had no debt. And nowadays the debt is huge, as you know. But not only for the pandemic. Don't make the mistake of silly people who say default. No, because the debt started in the 80s, in the last 40 years. The second reason of the crisis of the welfare state is of a moral nature. The first reason is financial. The second, moral. Why? Because the welfare state delegitimized the role of the principle of fraternity. Because people said, if it is the state which should take care of the needs, of the necessity of people, of everybody, why should I take care? If I observe a poor, why should I help the poor? I direct the poor to the government or to the offices, etc., etc. So that is obvious in many countries where the so-called horizontal relations among people were very strong. Now, today, the issue is we have to move from the welfare state to the welfare society. That is the slogan, welfare society, because it is the entire society which should take care of the needs of people. And within the society, you have the state, you have the corporations, you have third sector entities, what is called non-profit organization or third sector. In other words, the basic idea of the welfare society is the principle of subsidiarity. Unless we put into operation the principle of subsidiarity, otherwise there will be nothing to be done. because the government cannot exceed a certain threshold in terms of financing. But corporations, they have the money, I assure you, and they have big money, even too much. And so that money, but what is the rule? When I talk to big managers, they tell me, they say to me, we are happy to contribute, to give big money for the, but we need, or better to say, we want to be involved. We do not accept that the politician decides and then we have to pay what they have decided. If you want our money, we have to cooperate, what is called co-planning, and in Italian we say co-progettazione, co-programmazione. Because in other words, it is the whole society that should take care of the needs. And that is the path which is being, in particular in Europe, taken into serious consideration.
We have another question.
To conclude, the universalistic characterization of the welfare state should remain. Universalism means no discrimination of no type. The point is, what we have to change is not the ideal, but the governance. People confuse government with governance, which are two different concepts.
Thanks. We have another question from Roderick Patch, and I'm going to read it verbatim. How relevant or different is this model of society to the concept of the social market economy?
Sorry, say it again. What is the difference?
How relevant or different is this model of society different to the concept of social market economy?
Now, the notion of social market economy, as you know, is a particular model of organization of the society, which was elaborated in the interwar period, last century, mainly in Fribourg, Switzerland, and then Germany, and then Austria. And after the war, the Second World War, was the model that a leader like Adenauer adopted in his country. And it was a successful model, no doubt. Of course, the question that most people should ask is, why the social market economy, which had a great success, nobody disputed that, did not expand elsewhere? Why? Ask yourself. If a model has a success, why other countries such as Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, etc., did not follow suit? That is the question. The reason is that the conditions, now I have no time to elaborate, so I limit myself to the statement. The conditions, the structural and institutional conditions which are necessary in order to make the social market economy function are conditions that in countries different from Germany do not exist. And that is linked to the philosophical metrics, because unless you know some philosophy, you cannot understand certain things. Because you know that the philosophical metrics of the German culture is Kantism. Kant is the inventor of deontologies. England, as I said before at the beginning of my speech, is the country of utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is just the opposite of Kantism. On the other hand, countries like Italy or even Spain, they have another philosophical metrics, which is virtue ethics, going back to Aristotle and St. Thomas, virtue ethics. So it is obvious that if you pretend to transpose a model which was born in a particular territory, having a particular mentality, cultural mentality, into a country where the metrics, cultural metrics is different, cannot work. That is the point. The same is true if you go to Japan. To Japan, a model like social market cannot possibly work, which does not mean that that model is wrong. It's perfectly, but it's perfectly okay for that context. For that context. That is the point. When I give you an example, a concrete example, Pope Benedict XVI. Is he intelligent or not? Of course he's intelligent. He's a great theologian, philosopher, and he's German. Okay? When he wrote his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, which was published in the year 2009, the question was raised to him, why in that encyclical, signed by you German Pope, you never mention social market economy? Try to answer. Because he said, because I'm the Pope, I cannot propose something which comes from the experience of one country, although an important country. I have to speak to all the people in the world. And so he knew, because he's a man of great culture. I was amazed, even though he never studied economics. When I talked to him about certain economic concepts, he understood everything. That is because he's really intelligent. And he said, if I propose that, I would not help cultures, consider Latin American, for instance, or African countries. It would not possible. That is the answer to the question. So that it's a model which has its points of strength, force, and it did very well. The second remark is the following, that model presupposes national economies. But in an epoch of globalization, the social market economies enters into crisis. And you understand why. Because if you talk about of a closed economy, the government of that country dominates. But in a globalized world, you know the implication. That is the reason. Of course, you might say, but yes, because people use a social market economy not in the strict sense of the word. They use like a market economy paying attention to the social affairs. But that is not the social market economy. The social market economy is a particular model stemming from a particular philosophical, theoretical setup. Okay?
Thanks a lot, Professor Zamagni. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we need to bring this lecture to a close. Thanks goes to Professor Zamagni for delivering an interesting lecture, to Newsbook for having collaborated with the Maltese Young Christian Workers to set up the logistics for this lecture, and to you, the audience, for having attended this lecture. Finally, I encourage you to follow the Maltese Young Christian Worker Facebook page to keep updated with the events of the group, including details of our next lecture. Thanks again, and good night.
Thank you to you. And many wishes to all of you. I hope to be able to come to visit your beautiful island, which I like very much. And I would have preferred shaking my hands with you. But it will come that day, perhaps next year. Okay?
Thanks a
lot
for your nice words. Good night, and thanks a lot.
All the best. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.